August 1945. The war was over, but the air still carried the smell of gun oil and burnt rope. In the soft morning mist of a British POW camp in New South Wales, rows of Japanese prisoners stood motionless behind the wire, faces expressionless, uniforms torn, eyes dulled by defeat. The war they'd been told would never end in surrender had ended without honor, without glory, and without a single command to die for the Emperor. A whistle broke the silence. British guards stepped into view, clean uniforms, calm voices, clipboards in hand. The Japanese braced for insult or punishment. Instead, they heard words that made no sense. Roll call, please. Thank you, gentlemen. For a long moment, no one moved. Some stared straight ahead, unsure if it was mockery. Others lowered their eyes, confused. The sound of courtesy, of manners, and felt alien. These were not the barbarians they had been told about. In that instant, without gunfire or command, a new kind of battle began. One between pride and humanity. And to understand why that moment mattered, we must return to where this mindset began. In Imperial Japan itself, to understand the shock of a Japanese prisoner hearing please and thank you, one must first understand the empire that raised him. For decades, before the Second World War, Japan's military was built on an ancient code, Bushido, the way of the warrior. It was a moral system forged in the age of the samurai, rooted in loyalty, self-sacrifice, and honor unto death. In the Imperial Army of the 1930s and 1940s, Bushido was no longer a personal creed. It was state doctrine. Every soldier was taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. Worse than death, to be captured was not to survive. It was to cease being Japanese. Inside the Imperial Army, training crushed individuality. Recruits were beaten into submission, their humanity stripped in the name of discipline. Superiors ruled by humiliation and physical punishment. Officers were to be obeyed without hesitation, for hesitation was weakness, and weakness was betrayal. From the classroom to the battlefield, the message was relentless. A soldier who surrenders forfeits his soul. When the war in Asia exploded, from the invasion of China in 1937 to Pearl Harbor in 1941, Japan's military carried that ideology across oceans. Captured Allied troops from British to Australian to American felt the full consequence of a system that saw mercy as corruption. Prisoners were expendable, their suffering inconsequential. The Geneva Convention was dismissed as a Western luxury. For Japanese troops, kindness toward prisoners was an offense against the emperor. The propaganda of the time reinforced it. Newspapers, films, and military manuals spoke of Westerners as morally weak, soft men from decadent nations. To fall into their hands, it was said, would be worse than death. Soldiers were taught that Allied forces killed prisoners or used them for grotesque experiments. This belief was not questioned. It was law. So when the tide of war turned, when Japan's empire began to fracture under the weight of American industry and Allied advance, that same doctrine created a paradox. The soldiers who survived expected death, not capture. But the war was ending faster than they could die. By 1944, the great victories of the empire were gone. The jungles of Burma were graveyards. Saipan had fallen in July 1944, where thousands of Japanese civilians and soldiers leapt from cliffs rather than be taken alive. The Battle of Leyte Gulf later that year shattered the Imperial Navy. When Iwo Jima fell in March 1945, the myth of the invincible Japanese warrior cracked beyond repair. Still, even as the homeland faced firebombs and starvation, the Imperial Army refused to teach surrender. Commanders told their men that defeat was impossible. Reality, however, had already changed. When Hiroshima was destroyed on August 6th, and Nagasaki 3 days later, Japan's leaders hesitated, not because they thought they could still win, but because surrender defied everything they believed about being Japanese. It took Emperor Hirohito's personal voice, broadcast to a stunned nation on August 15th, to make it real. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, he said, a soft phrase for total collapse. In the Pacific, soldiers who heard the announcement reacted with disbelief, even fury. For some, it was a betrayal. For others, it was liberation from a death they had long prepared for. But the shock of defeat was followed by something deeper: captivity. Thousands of soldiers were rounded up by American, British, Australian, and Dutch forces. Many were malnourished, disease-ridden, and broken, yet they still clung to the instinct of defiance. To them, surrender was not safety. It was eternal shame. When Allied guards first encountered Japanese prisoners, they expected fanatical violence. And sometimes they got it. There were suicides, attempted escapes, even mutinies inside camps. But as the weeks passed, another kind of silence settled in, one of bewilderment. The British, Australian and American camp commanders followed their own code, not Bushido, but the Geneva Convention of 1929, which protected prisoners of war. Japan had signed it but never ratified it. The Allies, despite their own rage from atrocities in Bataan, Changi, and on the Burma-Thailand Railway, were instructed to treat captured Japanese humanely. Food rations were minimal, but fair. Medical attention was given when possible. Punishment, when required, was regulated. The treatment was far from comfortable, but it was structured, procedural, and rooted in the idea that even an enemy deserved dignity. For Japanese soldiers, this was incomprehensible. In their world, a captured enemy was worthless and a living symbol of weakness. Now, in the aftermath of defeat, they were the ones being guarded, counted, and spoken to politely. It inverted their entire understanding of power. The politeness of Allied guards was not merely cultural habit. It was deliberate policy. The British and Commonwealth Command understood that civility was not just moral, it was strategic. A calm, orderly camp reduced resistance. It prevented collective suicide or uprising. Politeness was control, delivered through the soft language of discipline. But to the prisoners, this civility carried emotional weight far beyond its purpose. Many believed it to be mockery, an elaborate humiliation. Others, after days or weeks, began to see something different. That the enemy's strength came from something Japan's war machine had stripped from them: compassion. One of the earliest recorded examples came from Australian-run camps in Cowra and Hay. Reports describe Japanese POWs bowing stiffly, refusing to speak, expecting abuse. Instead, guards enforced silence not through beatings but through procedure. Orders were given firmly but respectfully, one Australian sergeant recalled. We treated them as soldiers, not beasts. Even this simple humanity destabilized the Japanese prisoners' worldview. Their conditioning had told them that the West was barbaric. Yet in captivity, they were given medical treatment, food, and even tobacco. When they fell ill, Allied doctors, men they had once fought to kill, tended to their wounds. Letters from those years describe quiet moments of disbelief. A Japanese sergeant crying in secret after an Australian guard apologized for stepping on his sleeping mat. Another, who had lost half his platoon on New Guinea, wrote in repatriation documents that, "I realized the West fights with spirit, not hatred." To historians, this clash of manners was more than cultural. It was psychological warfare without violence. For centuries, Japan's warrior code defined honor through destruction, victory or death. But the Western military ethos, shaped by centuries of Christian ethics and Enlightenment thought, found honor in restraint. In that collision, amid the ashes of the Pacific, the real war, the war for meaning, and was still being fought. The paradox was stark. These same Allied nations had unleashed the atomic bomb and firebombed Tokyo into ash, yet the same system that commanded annihilation also ordered kindness to the defeated. For the prisoners, that duality was unfathomable. To them, Western morality was an illusion, until they experienced it firsthand. Over time, that experience began to erode the walls of propaganda. Some Japanese officers started cooperating, teaching their men discipline in captivity. Others learned English words of politeness, echoing what they heard at roll call: please, thank you, good morning. They did not yet understand them fully, but they sensed their power. This change did not happen overnight. It grew from daily repetition, from the same simple exchanges that once bewildered them. The moment of hearing please and thank you became a symbol of something greater, the slow rediscovery of humanity after ideological collapse. The war had ended, but for these men, the real reckoning had just begun. In the silence of captivity, they faced a truth more difficult than any battlefield: that the enemy they had been taught to despise could still show decency. And in that discovery, they began to question the beliefs that had ruled their lives. For in the calm routine of camp life, roll calls, meals, inspections, There was one recurring scene that captured this transformation more vividly than any other: the morning lineup, when the guards addressed them not with rage, but with respect. And it was in one of those lineups on a pale morning behind barbed wire that the most extraordinary reaction unfolded, the moment when Japanese pride met the Western word that disarmed it. The story of those camps was not only a meeting of two nations, but of two civilizations colliding through the smallest of gestures. The war had been fought with bullets and bombs, but now in captivity, it continued through words, through tone, through posture, through manners. There were three sides to this silent struggle: the Japanese prisoners, the Allied guards, and the space between them, a space filled with misunderstanding, discipline, and fragile humanity. The prisoners for the Japanese soldier. Surrender was a fate worse than execution. In the Imperial Army, to die was to ascend in honor. To live as a captive was to descend into shame. In those first days of captivity, many refused to eat, believing that life after surrender was meaningless. Some turned their faces to the wall during roll call. Others mutilated themselves in secret, trying to restore a sense of control. A few even asked their captors to let them die. Allied doctors recorded these moments with confusion. To the Western mind, survival was instinct. To the Japanese, it was defiance of identity. The code drilled into every recruit, yokusai, the honorable death, had not vanished with the Emperor's broadcast. It lived inside them. When captured on Pacific Islands or jungles of Burma, most expected execution. When that didn't come, they waited for humiliation. Instead, they encountered something stranger: order. The camps were austere, but they were clean. British and Australian guards addressed prisoners by rank. Rules were enforced with authority, not cruelty. The Japanese watched in silence as guards saluted their own officers, obeyed chain of command, and conducted themselves with a kind of impersonal professionalism. For men who had been raised in a system where power was demonstrated through violence, this restraint felt alien, even threatening. Yet it began to work on them. Slowly. Reports from the Kaura camp describe how Japanese prisoners at first refused to sit in the presence of guards, believing themselves beneath contempt. But when guards began using polite forms, "Please line up," "Thank you for waiting," some POWs hesitated. Politeness in their mind was a language of equality. They did not understand why it was being directed toward them. Weeks passed. The men began to respond. They followed commands more readily, saluted correctly, even began tidying their quarters beyond requirement. For the first time, order was not driven by fear but by dignity. It was the politeness, that quiet please and thank you, that first pierced the wall of indoctrination. The guards on the other side of the wire. The Allied guards had their own battle to fight. Many had fought in the Pacific or lost comrades there. They had seen Japanese troops fight to the death, refuse surrender, and commit atrocities against Allied POWs. For these men, the thought of showing kindness to a Japanese prisoner was not natural. It was duty forced by discipline. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Thompson, a British officer in charge of a camp in Singapore, later wrote, "We were ordered to treat them as prisoners of war, not animals." It was difficult. The men had lost brothers on the Burma Railway, yet the King's regulations left no room for vengeance. The discipline that held those camps together was built on something the British Army called military civility, a tradition dating back centuries, where the behavior of a soldier reflected the honor of his nation. In 1945, after years of bitter war, that tradition was tested in every POW compound across the Commonwealth. Australian guards at Hay Camp were given specific orders: avoid violence, maintain dignity, and address prisoners firmly but respectfully. A corporal recalled later that his sergeant told him, "They'll respect order, not anger." It proved true. Whenever a guard lost his temper, shouting, striking, or mocking, resistance increased. When commands were calm, structured, and laced with courtesy, order prevailed. To the guards, politeness was a tool of control. To the prisoners, it became something deeper, a mirror of a value they had lost. But civility did not erase tension. There were moments when hatred cracked through. The Kaura breakout in 1944, a mass escape attempt by over 1,000 Japanese POWs, had left more than 230 dead, mostly by suicide. The memory haunted both sides. Even after that, When new prisoners arrived after Japan's surrender, the guards remembered those nights of blood and chaos. Yet the policy stood firm. Humane treatment above all. Each please and thank you spoken across that wire was a small act of control over chaos. It reminded the guards and their prisoners that discipline was not weakness. It was strength contained. The clash of worlds inside the wire, two civilizations now existed in parallel. The Japanese held morning calisthenics, saluted portraits of the emperor, and whispered prayers to ancestors they believed had abandoned them. The British ran inspections, kept logs, and reported to command. Between them hung the silence of misunderstanding. The Japanese could not fathom a world where the enemy kept his word. The Allies could not understand an enemy who had once refused mercy, but now accepted it. And yet, the daily rhythm of camp life began to erode those divisions. Every morning at roll call, the guards' voices carried across the yard, firm, rhythmic, polite. "Form ranks, please." "Thank you." The Japanese began echoing those words among themselves, not mockingly and experimentally. They wanted to understand why the enemy used them. In Japanese, courtesy is codified, rank determines tone, and every word reflects hierarchy. But the English please and thank you were different. They were gestures of mutual respect, not submission. To a man raised in Bushido, where all relationships were vertical, this concept was revolutionary. Some prisoners began imitating Western manners, saluting differently, adopting calm posture, even smiling. Guards noted these changes with surprise. "They became more human to us," wrote one private in his diary. "Not the mad fanatics we'd been told about, but ordinary men trying to understand a strange world." Through this subtle exchange, both sides were learning the same truth, that humanity could survive even the ruins of ideology. Psychological shock historians later described this as cognitive dissonance, the mental collapse that occurs when deeply held beliefs meet undeniable contradiction. For Japanese POWs, the contradiction was absolute. They had been told the Allies were monsters, yet in captivity they were fed, sheltered, and spoken to politely. They had been told surrender erased honor, yet they were addressed as sir, their ranks sometimes even acknowledged. They had been told Westerners had no soul, yet they saw them grieve their dead, write home, and speak of family with tenderness. The politeness of Allied guards forced a mirror upon them. In one documented case from the Loveday camp in South Australia, a Japanese sergeant was so confused by his treatment that he begged to see the camp commandant. When granted permission, he knelt and asked, "Why are you kind to us? We are your enemy." The commandant replied simply, "Because the war is over." That answer spread through the camp like fire. For the first time, the prisoners began to believe it. The war was truly over, not just the fighting, the hate. In the quiet routines of captivity, those men discovered a reality they had never been allowed to imagine, that their enemy could possess discipline without cruelty. Cultural reversal, it is important to understand how revolutionary that idea was. In Imperial Japan, manners were a reflection of hierarchy, not empathy. To bow was to acknowledge superiority. To speak softly was to preserve harmony within a rigid order. But Allied courtesy came from a different foundation, the moral individual. The British officer saying thank you did not imply weakness or submission. He affirmed that even in war, a man retained moral agency. That ideal had been inherited from centuries of military tradition, from the chivalric codes of Europe to the Enlightenment principles that shaped Western law. To the Japanese prisoners, whose obedience had been absolute, this was unfathomable. Yet in daily repetition, they began to sense the power in such behavior. Power through control, through calm, through humanity. Many guards noticed subtle changes in demeanor. Some POWs began bowing less rigidly, saluting more naturally. Some even learned fragments of English. "Good morning." "Thank you." Others began teaching origami or calligraphy to their captors. Music too crossed the wire, harmonicas from British soldiers, soft songs from Japanese prisoners at dusk. The same men who once screamed, "Banzai," in suicidal charges now stood quietly in line, acknowledging a please with a nod. It was not submission. It was awakening. The human connection among the recorded testimonies from those camps are fragments that reveal something deeper than politics or procedure, moments of shared humanity. British Guard in Malaya recalled one Japanese prisoner who, after recovering from illness, bowed deeply and said, "Thank you, Dr. San." It was the first English phrase he had ever spoken. The guard, hardened by years of war, later admitted he wept privately that night. Another story came from the Philippines, where an American lieutenant watched a group of prisoners line up for breakfast, each one repeating "thank you" after receiving their portion. They said it awkwardly, he wrote, but you could tell they meant it. It was as if they were learning to be human again. Not all encounters were gentle. Some guards could not suppress bitterness. Some camps remained harsh, their officers brutal. Yet across the theater a pattern emerged. The politest camps were the most stable. Violence decreased where dignity was practiced. For the Japanese, politeness had once been a ritual mask, a form of obedience. In captivity, it became something new, a means of survival and later understanding. The guards' realization. As time passed, the guards themselves began to see their prisoners differently. Beneath the uniform and the indoctrination, they saw men not unlike themselves, sons, fathers, soldiers broken by orders they did not choose. By maintaining civility, the guards reclaimed something war had tried to erase, their own humanity. "Every time I said please," one Australian corporal recalled, "I was reminding myself that we were better than the cruelty we'd seen." In that sense, politeness became an act of moral defiance. It was a refusal to become the thing the enemy believed them to be. The Quiet Revolution. By 1946, as repatriation began, Japanese prisoners across camps in the Pacific had undergone a transformation that no ideology could have predicted. Their bodies were still in chains, but their understanding of the world had shifted. In post-war reports, many described their captors as disciplined and fair. Others wrote that their image of the West had been shattered, not by conquest, but by decency. This was the unseen revolution of the war's end, not fought in skies or seas, but in the stillness of barbed wire yards through gestures of manners, restraint, and civility. The clash between Bushido and the Geneva Convention did not end in blood. It ended with words, simple, soft, polite, and it all converged in a single, unforgettable morning. The roll call where the words "please" and "thank you" were, heard by men who once believed they would die before surrendering. That morning became the turning point, the moment when courtesy defeated indoctrination. The sun rose pale over the camp's perimeter wire. The air was cold and still, carrying the scent of damp earth and canvas. It was roll call, the same as every morning, yet this one would be remembered long after rifles and ranks had been forgotten. A whistle sounded, short and sharp. The prisoners filed out from their huts in columns of 5, boots scraping the gravel. Their movements were precise, mechanical, shaped by years of military habit. Faces blank, eyes forward. Shame weighed heavier than their thin wool coats. To them, captivity was a wound that never stopped bleeding. On the opposite side of the compound, the British Guards formed their own line. Their uniforms were pressed, rifles slung neatly at the shoulder. These men had fought in Burma, Malaya, and New Guinea. Some bore scars, physical and unseen, yet their demeanor was steady, voices measured. Each morning's ritual was more than administration. It was discipline restored from the chaos of war. A young lieutenant, not much older than 30, stepped forward with his clipboard. His name was Captain Harold Bennett of the British Army Service Corps. He had seen the brutality of the Jungle Campaign and carried within him the images of friends executed by the very army now standing before him. But orders were orders. The prisoners were to be treated under the Geneva Convention, and Bennett believed in those orders. He adjusted his cap, took a breath, and spoke the first words. "Good morning." "Roll call, please." The sentence hung in the air, soft but firm. It crossed the space between captor and captive like a tremor. The Japanese stood motionless. Some blinked. Others glanced at one another. They had expected command, not courtesy. The word "please" was not part of their world. Bennett continued, reading names from his list. Sergeant Kobayashi. Lieutenant Nakamura. "Thank you." Still silence. The guards exchanged looks. To them, this politeness was routine and a mark of order. To the prisoners, it was a language they had never heard in war. In Imperial Japan, officers commanded through fear. Superiors shouted, struck, humiliated. The military was a pyramid of cruelty, each level crushing the one below. Here their enemy used calmness instead of anger. It was disorienting. Kobayashi, a former non-commissioned officer from the 55th Division, stared at the British captain with disbelief. He had survived the jungles of Burma, malaria, starvation, and the suicide of his company commander. When captured, he expected torture. Instead, the enemy offered him a cigarette, then called him sir. The politeness haunted him more than any blow could have. That morning, as Bennett's voice echoed across the camp, Kobayashi felt something fracture inside him. He remembered his own recruits, the ones he had slapped for disobedience, the men who had begged for rest during forced marches. He had believed brutality was duty. Now he saw the enemy achieve perfect discipline without raising a hand. The roll call ended. Bennett closed his clipboard and nodded. "Thank you, gentlemen. Dismissed." The guards turned smartly, marching off in step. The prisoners remained standing. Some lowered their heads. Others stared at the ground, unwilling to show confusion. But among them, something irreversible had begun. Later that day in the mess hut, an interpreter reported what he had seen. "They looked surprised," he told the captain. "They don't understand why you speak like that." Bennett replied simply, "Because war is finished. We are soldiers, not savages." That night, silence hung heavier than usual over the camp. The Japanese men sat around the dim lamps of their huts, whispering. They spoke not of home or food, but of the strange civility of their captors. To them, these words, "please and thank you," carried a power they could not define. It was as if language itself had become a weapon of grace. Days passed. The roll calls continued unchanged. Every morning, the same polite tone, the same calm gestures. And every morning, more prisoners began to respond. They stood straighter, saluted more neatly, and eventually some began to echo the words back. The first time it happened, it startled everyone. During inspection, when a guard handed a prisoner a water canteen, the man bowed slightly and said, "Thank you." His accent was broken, his tone hesitant, but the meaning was unmistakable. The guard froze for a second, then nodded. "You're welcome." From that day forward, small gestures multiplied. Japanese prisoners began helping guards carry supplies, tidying their living quarters without orders, and even exchanging English phrases. Some began writing them down in notebooks. Words that once belonged to their conquerors became symbols of something new, dignity regained not through violence, but humility. In the diary of Corporal David Ellis, a guard stationed at Hay Camp, an entry from November 1945 reads, "The Japs are different now. They bow less but nod more. They try to speak. One of them said good morning to me today. It was odd. Felt like we were equals for a second. After all that's happened, it's hard to explain, but I think they're learning something. And so are we." The change wasn't confined to one camp. Reports from across the Commonwealth, from Borneo, Burma, and the Philippines, tell the same story. Prisoners who had once viewed politeness as weakness began to mirror it. Guards who had entered the war with hatred began to see humanity where they least expected it. For the Japanese prisoners, this transformation was deeply personal. Inside their minds, two forces collided: the ghost of Bushido and the reality of defeat. They had been raised to believe that mercy was deception, yet here it was, daily, consistent, unbreakable. Many could not reconcile it. Some broke down. Others wrote confessions in notebooks given by camp officers. In one, found decades later in archives, a soldier wrote, "When the enemy said thank you, I felt my heart move. I could not hate him anymore. I began to feel shame not for surrender, but for what we had done." This quiet psychological revolution was happening everywhere, unseen by the world outside the wire. While Tokyo struggled under occupation and tribunals judged generals for war crimes, the men inside those camps were confronting their own trials, not of law, but of conscience. Captain Bennett noticed it too. He saw the prisoners' eyes change, the stiffness fade from their salutes. The language barrier remained, but tone bridged what words could not. He realized that the British system of discipline, formality, calm, precision, was more than tradition. It was moral engineering. In a letter home he wrote, "Strange, isn't it, that our best weapon here is manners? The men obey faster when we use courtesy. It disarms them completely. You can see it in their faces. They don't know how to fight back against decency." He was right. By 1946, Japanese camps across the Pacific were remarkably orderly. Incidents of resistance dropped sharply. Medical teams reported better morale, even cooperation. The British War Office noted in reports that prisoners respond favorably to consistent civility. What began as a command policy had become a bridge between enemies. There were moments of tension still, reminders that war's wounds do not heal evenly. One evening, a guard found a group of prisoners burning paper effigies in a corner of the yard. It was a ritual farewell to fallen comrades. When ordered to stop, the men bowed and apologized. The guard, touched by their sincerity, allowed them to finish. Later, one prisoner approached and said in halting English, "Thank you, please." The words were awkward, but their meaning carried weight far beyond grammar. That night, the same guard wrote in his logbook, "They no longer hate us. I think they fear something else now, and the truth." For some prisoners, that truth would only emerge years later. When they were finally repatriated to Japan, they returned to a homeland transformed. Cities in ruins, the emperor's divinity dissolved, the army dismantled. Yet what they carried back was not just defeat, but a seed of understanding. Many spoke to their families of the shock they felt when Western guards treated them kindly. Some refused to describe the war itself, but spoke only of the small courtesies, the please, the thank you, the way enemies had shown patience instead of rage. Historians later found that several former POWs became teachers, diplomats, or advocates for peace. They had seen a different kind of strength, not born from command or ideology, but from restraint. In one striking account, a former Japanese lieutenant named Keiji Noma recalled a roll call at a British camp in Singapore. The officer said, "Please stand in line." I could not believe it. That word, and please, it struck my heart like a sword. No one in our army had ever spoken it. It was as if the enemy was saying, "You are still human." I realized in that moment that everything I had believed was false. That moment, repeated in dozens of camps across the Pacific, became the silent climax of a moral war that outlived the gunfire. The politeness of the captors had achieved what bombs could not. It broke the spiritual armor of indoctrination, and yet it did not humiliate. It invited reflection. The Japanese prisoners, stripped of empire, faced an idea far more powerful than conquest, the idea that even in defeat, dignity could survive. Months later, when repatriation began in 1946, the camps prepared for farewell. Prisoners lined up for their final roll call before boarding ships home. Many saluted the guards as equals. Some bowed deeply. Others simply whispered, "Thank you." Captain Bennett, now thinner and weary, returned the gesture with a nod. "Safe journey, gentlemen," he said softly. For a moment, the line between victor and vanquished disappeared. What remained were men. Soldiers who had seen the worst of humanity and in the end glimpsed its opposite. As the trucks rolled away, the guards stood watching the dust settle over the road. No one spoke. The war in all its forms was finally ending, but something in that silence felt eternal. The quiet realization that kindness could wound deeper than cruelty and heal faster than time. That roll call, that simple exchange of words, became a symbol of everything the war had taught and unlearned. It showed that power could reside not in the bark of command, but in the restraint of compassion. For the Japanese prisoners, those moments of civility were not just a shock, they were revelation. For the British and Allied guards, they were a reminder that victory was not only measured by surrender, but by the ability to remain human when it was hardest. And from that day on, every please and thank you spoken across the wire carried the weight of an empire's undoing, and the beginning of something profoundly new. The battles were over, but what followed, the reckoning, the rebuilding, and the rediscovery of shared humanity, would reshape both nations for decades to come. When the gates of the camps finally opened, the war had been over for months, but peace still felt uncertain, fragile like a truce between ghosts. Across Asia and the Pacific, Tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners of war stood in silence as Allied officers read the lists of names. They were going home, to a country they no longer recognized, and to a world that no longer feared them. Ships waited in harbors from Singapore to Sydney, repatriation vessels bearing names that once symbolized victory, now carrying the remnants of an army that had once believed it would never surrender. Each man stepped aboard carrying only a small bag, a ration of biscuits, and a question that would haunt them for decades. What had it all been for? The Allied command had ensured that repatriation was to be orderly and humane. The Geneva Convention was followed to the letter. Every prisoner was issued clean clothing, a medical inspection, and a meal before departure. On the docks, guards, many of whom had once hated the men they now escorted, saluted as they boarded. Some prisoners bowed deeply in return. Others could not meet their captors' eyes, ashamed of the courtesy being shown to them. From 1945 to 1947, more than 700,000 Japanese POWs were repatriated from camps across the Pacific and Asia. Australia alone held over 12,000. Thousands more had been detained in British India, New Guinea, and the Philippines. Their return was a logistical triumph and a moral experiment. In the eyes of the victors, these men were still soldiers, bound by honor to their emperor. Yet by the time they boarded those ships, their understanding of that word, honor, had changed. The quiet transformation, inside the camps, politeness had begun as discipline. Outside them, it became memory. For many Japanese soldiers, those small courtesies, the please, the thank you, the calm tone of command, became the defining memory of captivity. It was not the barbed wire or the hunger they spoke of years later, but the way the enemy had treated them when all power was theirs to abuse. Historians examining repatriation interviews noted a recurring theme. When asked what surprised them most about captivity, many prisoners answered simply, they were kind. That kindness left an imprint that would echo into Japan's post-war reconstruction. For a generation raised on obedience and domination, to encounter an enemy who ruled through fairness and order rather than fear forced a deep re-evaluation. Some former prisoners described how their perception of Western culture had completely inverted. They had been told the West was arrogant, godless, selfish. Yet in the camps, they saw men share cigarettes, apologize when stepping on a shoe, say thank you to subordinates. These small gestures became seeds of something larger, the recognition that power and morality could coexist. The return home, when the ships arrived in Japan, the prisoners were greeted not as heroes but as outcasts. Their families wept, but society turned its gaze away. To have been captured was still a stain, an unspoken shame. The Imperial Army had collapsed, but its code had not yet died. For months, returning POWs were forced to undergo cleansing interviews by occupation authorities. They were questioned about their treatment, their loyalty, their understanding of Allied policies. Many spoke carefully, wary of being misunderstood. But within their testimonies lay a quiet admiration, not for Allied power, but for Allied restraint. A former sergeant interviewed in 1946 said the British treated us like soldiers, not slaves. It was strange. We were enemies, yet they spoke to us with manners. I began to think, perhaps their strength comes from this. His words reflected a broader realization taking hold in post-war Japan, that the old values of dominance, cruelty, and blind obedience had brought only ruin. In their place, new values began to grow, rooted not in submission but in civility. For those who had experienced captivity, politeness became a personal creed. Some became teachers and scholars who later helped reframe Japan's national ethos. Others joined movements advocating pacifism or international cooperation. A few entered politics carrying with them a belief that the future would not be rebuilt by conquest, but by respect. The Allied perspective for the Allied soldiers who had been guards, the memory of those camps also endured. Many had gone to war filled with rage, hardened by atrocities, yet in the months and years after, they often spoke of captivity as the place where they rediscovered their own humanity. In letters and memoirs, guards described the strange satisfaction of enforcing order without cruelty. It was the first time I felt like a soldier again, one British corporal wrote. Not a killer, but a man doing his duty with honor intact. To them, saying please and thank you was not sentimentality, it was control, professionalism, and moral authority. It reminded them of why they fought, to defend a way of life that valued restraint even in victory. When war crimes tribunals were held, many former guards gave testimony that reflected this philosophy. They spoke of treating prisoners with fairness not because they pitied them, but because the rules mattered. It was the difference between civilization and chaos, the same difference, that had divided the Allies from the fascist powers they defeated. Rebuilding and reflection. Japan's reconstruction after 1945 was unlike any in modern history. The country was broken physically and spiritually. Cities were flattened, the economy shattered, and the imperial myth dissolved. Yet from that devastation rose a new identity, one that valued cooperation, humility, and respect. This cultural rebirth did not come from propaganda or coercion. It emerged from millions of personal reckonings, from soldiers who had seen what cruelty produced and what civility could heal. In 1946, Japanese newspapers began publishing essays by former soldiers reflecting on defeat. One, written by a former officer held in a British camp, read, "We believed strength was cruelty. We learned too late that true strength is calmness. The enemy showed us this when they said please and thank you. It was not weakness. It was power with a human face." Such reflections would become part of a broader cultural shift known as the post-war humanism movement. In literature, education, and politics, Japan began redefining honor, no longer as blind loyalty but as moral integrity. The same men who had once been captives became, in a sense, ambassadors of civility. Their memories of fair treatment in Allied camps became stories told in classrooms, community halls, and memoirs. They spoke of their confusion, their shame, and finally their gratitude, the numbers behind humanity. By 1947, nearly all Japanese POWs held by Western powers had been returned. Mortality rates in British and Commonwealth camps were below 5%, extraordinarily low compared to the horrific figures of Allied POWs held by Japan, where mortality often exceeded 30%. The contrast spoke volumes. The difference was not merely logistical, it was ideological. The Allied camp system had been built on the principle that discipline and morality must coexist. Every regulation, from sanitation to speech, was written with the understanding that how one treated the defeated defined the victor. This commitment to order through civility did not erase wartime bitterness. It did not bring back the dead, but it did create a foundation for reconciliation. It allowed former enemies to face one another years later, not as monsters, but as men who had both suffered under ideologies that demanded everything and forgave nothing. The seeds of reconciliation in the 1950s, as Japan rejoined the international community, many of those same ex-prisoners found themselves working alongside British and Australian officials in trade and diplomacy. The politeness that had once symbolized surrender became the hallmark of a new national identity. Japanese manners, once militarized and rigid, evolved into the famously courteous culture recognized today, precise, respectful, quietly powerful. Historians often debate how much of that transformation was influenced by occupation reforms versus cultural evolution. Yet within oral histories of ex-POWs, one thread remains consistent, that the experience of being treated humanely by their former enemies changed them profoundly. One Japanese veteran, who later became a professor, told his students in the 1960s, "The word thank you was the first word that made me doubt everything I had been taught. It was doubt that built peace." The Guards' legacy for the Guards, the legacy was equally deep. Many carried guilt for feeling sympathy toward men they had once fought. Some struggled to reconcile their memories of Japanese brutality with the respect they came to feel in captivity. Yet most agreed on one thing. They had seen humanity survive where it should have died. Captain Harold Bennett, whose calm voice had once echoed across that roll call yard, returned to civilian life in England. In his letters, preserved by his family, he wrote of the experience often. One passage reads, "War stripped us bare, but when we spoke to them with courtesy, we saw their masks fall away. They stopped being enemies. They became mirrors. Perhaps that's what victory truly means, to stay human when hate has every reason to make you otherwise." For Bennett, and many like him, that was the lasting triumph, not the surrender of an empire, but the preservation of a soul. The quiet aftermath by the 1970s. The men who had lived those days were aging. The camps had long been dismantled, the fences gone, the huts reclaimed by time. Yet in interviews and reunions, their story still circled back to those same words: please and thank you. In one reunion in Tokyo, former Japanese POWs met with British veterans who had served as guards. They bowed to one another. Some cried. One elderly Japanese man said softly in English, "You taught us peace." The British veteran shook his head. "No," he replied. "We just remembered our manners." That moment, quiet, sincere, unadorned, captured the essence of what had happened decades earlier behind the wire. Courtesy had transcended language, nation, and hatred. It had turned enemies into men capable of seeing each other again as human. The war had ended in atomic fire and global despair. But within the small, controlled world of the POW camps, a different kind of ending unfolded. One measured not by explosions, but by words. Those words, gentle, deliberate, ordinary, carried the weight of civilization itself. And from their echo, Japan would emerge not just rebuilt, but reborn. From this aftermath came a lesson far greater than victory or loss. It was the rediscovery that even in the darkest aftermath of war, the smallest gestures of decency could reshape nations. The soldiers who once bowed to cruelty had learned to bow to civility. And the guards who once carried hate had learned that mercy could discipline better than rage ever could. Their story would linger. Quiet, invisible, yet powerful enough to change the meaning of war itself. And in that silence after the roll call, one truth remained: the strongest nations are not those that conquer, but those that remember to say please and thank you. The war had begun in fury, in fire, ideology, and unrelenting faith in violence. It ended not with another weapon, but with a word. Across the ruins of Asia and the Pacific, the soldiers who had once screamed oaths of loyalty to an emperor found themselves quietly repeating the gentlest phrases of their former enemies. Please. Thank you. Good morning. Words that carried no rank, no command, no threat, only respect. In those words, they found something their empire had never given them: the freedom to be human again. History often remembers the grand victories, the battles, the treaties, the flags raised over shattered cities. But the truest victory of the Second World War may have been this: that after the destruction of nations, men could still choose civility over vengeance. The British guard who refused to shout. The Japanese prisoner who whispered gratitude. Together they proved that morality is not erased by war. It only waits to be rediscovered. From that rediscovery grew something larger than reconciliation. It became the moral foundation of post-war Japan, a culture rebuilt not on conquest but on courtesy. The country that once worshipped death in service of the state began to value life in service of others. Factories, schools, and offices echoed with the same words once heard through the barbed wire, the small rituals of politeness that defined a new strength. For the men who lived it, those moments behind the fence never left them. They carried the memory like a scar, quiet, invisible, but sacred. In later years, when they bowed to strangers on city streets or thanked a shopkeeper with sincerity, perhaps they were remembering that morning when the enemy had called them gentlemen. In the end, it was not defeat that transformed them. It was decency. And that is the paradox of war's end, that the final act of victory is not to destroy one's enemy, but to remain civilized in their presence. So when a Japanese prisoner first heard the guard say please and thank you, it was more than courtesy. It was the sound of humanity returning, soft, steady, and stronger than any empire could ever be.